Welcome to the Longevity Forum podcast, a series on achieving longer, healthier, and more fulfilled lives for as many as possible. In this episode, we're thrilled to have Andy Elder, President of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, who will be speaking with Debbie Price, Professor of Social Gerontology at the University of Manchester. We have a great discussion ahead of us, so I'll leave the rest to you, Debbie.
Thanks very much, Laura, and welcome everybody. As Laura said, I'm Debbie. I'm a professor of social gerontology in Manchester, and I'm really delighted to be speaking today to Andy, Professor Andrew Elder. He's very well known in the gerontology community, first geriatrician to become president of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and an expert in the teaching and assessment of clinical skills, an NHS consultant since 1993. He's taught or assessed bedside skills in more than 20 countries, and in 2021, he was honoured by the prestigious award of Mastership of the American College of Physicians. He's recently spent a year as a visiting professor at Stanford Medicine, writing a book about the implications of frailty for Western societies, which we'll hopefully hear a little bit more about in a moment. So welcome, Andy.
Thanks very much, Debbie, for the invitation and for the introduction.
Great. So I think a good place for us to start, we're going to be talking today about later life, the fourth age of frailty and dependency, and the need to recognise and value that part of the life course. So I think let's start by talking about the narratives of healthy ageing on the one hand and frailty on the other hand. I wondered how you see this in current public and medical discourses and how you think we should be seeing it. Do you think that in our kind of overwhelming desire to present ageing positively, we miss something important about the ageing process?
Yeah, well, thanks. And I'm glad that you've actually used that phrase there, the fourth age, Debbie, in your question, because it is the fourth age as defined, I think, first by Laslett, that I'm most interested in. As you know, the third age, which is that period of our lives when we are older, typically out of, beyond employment and enjoying a healthy and productive older life, we've become, in my view, over-focused and over-obsessed with that at the expense of the fourth age. And that part of our life course is the part when we are no longer healthy. We may not be independent. We will therefore likely be dependent on others, and we may well have dementia. And I think that it is quite right, of course, as a society and as a medical community to focus on trying to ensure that as many of the population age well and have a very, very limited period of their lives towards the end of their lives when they are dependent and unwell. But we've perhaps done that to too much of an extreme at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think that's happened? Why do you think we have so much emphasis on the period of life when, we can do all sorts of things and so little discussion about potentially difficulties that people might have in the last few years, particularly of their lives?
I mean, I think it's probably two things, one positive and one kind of negative. The positive one is that, healthy retirement, if I can call it that, the third, let's again call it Laslett's third age, that's a dream period for many people in their lives, isn't it? When you no longer have to go to work every day, when you've got the freedom to do what you want, as your personal resources permit, when you may be able to travel, when you may be able to enjoy the company of friends more, etc., etc. So it's a period that many of us would aspire to. That's the positive bit. The negative bit is I think that the fourth age is just associated with death. And we know that there is a reluctance of society at large to acknowledge the biological certainty that is death. The fourth age and dependency towards the end of life and before death is not a certainty, but there's a high probability that that will occur. And I think we push that out of our minds. We don't want to think about that, one, because of its proximity to death, and two, because it's not the type of aging that we want to think of for ourselves.
Yeah, I guess there's much narratives of decline as of death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not only a fear of death, but possibly a fear of decline and loss in that period before death. What implications do you think all of that actually has in practicality, in real life, in medical practice, in social care practice, for the well-being of older people? Do you think it matters?
Yes, no, I think it matters, very much. And one could argue that the particular situation that our own National Health Service and other health services around the world find themselves in is the fact that they've denied that there may be a period of dependency and frailty, to use that word, towards the end of life. We've imagined that through better preventative methods, and particularly this idea of the compression of morbidity at the end of life, that we'll have a population who age healthily and then suddenly die, without any period of dependency at the end of life. So we've maybe seen things too much that way, and the not only has this now produced a situation in which we've not developed services well enough to care for an increasing number of dependent older people, but those individuals are at risk of being marginalized, of being othered, of being blamed at worse, for the travails of our health services. There is this word that I find quite interesting as well of what some people have called frailure, the combination of frailty and failure. And I think for some individuals, if you don't have this dream third age type of aging, this healthy longevity, then that is a failure in itself.
Yeah,
and we
like a moral failure, really, a moral or personal failure.
Yeah, and we cannot look at it like that, because that's not fair on the individuals who become dependent, and it's not a reflection of either aging or disease, actually.
So I think in this context, the formal characterization of people as frail has become quite important in clinical medicine. And I wondered if you could talk perhaps a little bit about that and tell us how you characterize frailty in clinical work and what implications you think that has for good or worse.
Yeah, well, I think overall it is for the good that we are moving from, we're using the term either frailty or living with frailty more. I think that is beneficial overall. And we're also moving from what used to be quite subjective classifications of individuals to more objective classifications. We used to almost joke in clinical practice that if you took, let's say, a heart surgeon to the bedside of a patient and asked them whether or not they were frail, they would be more likely to say that the patient was frail than somebody like me, who's a geriatrician, who's looking at a different range of people, a different range of characteristics, a different range of phenotypes every day. And in the change in classification that's happened recently, some using very strict and measurement-based definitions of frailty, like grip strength. Doctors like measurements, so there are a number of measurements that people try and use. But in moving from loose subjective definitions to ones that are more objective, and I would include measurements as well as the sort of what I would call phenotypic ones, like the best known as Rockwood's frailty score, which really just has very brief thumbnail sketches of an individual plus a little image. And that does help doctors in clinical practice think about a patient's degree of frailty. And that's important because it does actually predict individual people's capacity to benefit from different types of treatments and interventions, and also the risks of different types of interventions that might be offered to them. So it's beneficial, I feel, the way we're moving with the frailty agenda.
I guess the pandemic that we've all lived through and are continuing to live through here in January 2023, but it's brought some of this into really stark visibility because of the exponential rise of mortality from COVID with age. And some people have argued, and there's been a couple of studies, qualitative type studies about this, that the characterization of some people as frail using frailty scores, the kind that you might be describing, could potentially lead to their getting less than optimal treatment. So I guess two questions there is, one, do you think that's something that's happened over the last 2 to 3 years? And if that has, what's the answer to this?
Well, I think that what happened in the midst of COVID will be investigated in great detail in the forthcoming COVID inquiries. And there'll be lots of different opinions expressed about the specifics of what happened in a period of great uncertainty. Remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were fears that hospital systems would be overwhelmed in a way that they actually turned out not to be.
Sure.
And I think we have to see the context of some of the suggested avenues of clinical decision making in that context. But what the other thing I'd point out, Debbie, is that mortality in COVID, or with many conditions, rises. Yes, it does rise with age, but the more powerful predictors of mortality or poor outcomes of any sort, or lack of ability to benefit from a treatment, are actually what we would call comorbidities, the presence of disease or diseases in association with age, plus frailty, as measured, for example, by a Rockwood score, in association with your age. And what I would stress, I think, is what I said a moment ago then, when we're talking about frailty in general, is that the purpose of trying to grade the degree of frailty that somebody has in the way that doctors currently have is not actually primarily to limit their access to potentially beneficial treatments. It is to ensure that they're not put through treatments that they cannot benefit from. And I think it really is very important that we realize the pace that medicine has moved on at. There's more and more that you could do for an individual. But the real question in clinical practice is not what you could do, it's what you should do. And in speaking to an individual patient about all their different treatment and investigation options, it's very, very important that we have a way of explaining to them their capacity to benefit. Because many people, when they realize the limited potential there is for benefit from a given treatment, will decline it. And I think that's good medicine. That is patient-centered medicine, and it's sharing decision-making with patients, informed by, as I say, their capacity to benefit.
I guess that takes us on to one of your special superpowers, Andy, about bedside skills and clinical skills. I'm wondering whether you could perhaps spend a couple of minutes telling us what you think the implications of this whole discussion might be for, both initial curriculum training and also for continuing professional education, because these have been very difficult conversations to have, made much more difficult by the COVID environment, I'm sure. And do we have a clinical workforce equipped to have these sorts of conversations, or what should we do about that?
Well, healthcare, I would say, we have to remember, and this sounds a bit obvious, is a people project. It is, unfortunately, it has been increasingly changed, I would say, from from a relational field to a transactional field in which we do things to people, and that is not good medicine. Our workforce, people who go into healthcare in general, in my experience, this isn't just doctors, nurses, others, they want to relate to the people they look after and help them make good decisions about their care. I think that going back to medicine and my interest in what you would call core bedside skills, then those skills, and that's the ability to speak to a patient and gather information from them, to communicate with the patient and give them and explain information to them, and also physical examination, the ability to pick up information from the patient by examining them. These are all fundamental to building a relationship with the patient, number one, and also getting to know them in a way that helps you make good shared decisions. So we've drifted away in the UK a bit from that. We've drifted away from it even more in the USA, where, as you said in the introduction, I've spent a bit of time. But I think most healthcare professionals want to try and practice medicine in that way. The main barrier, though, is time.
Yeah.
Time is the most precious commodity to any clinician, but the demand on our time now is such that we don't get to do things in the way that we feel we should be doing them. Hence what you will have read about to do with what people call moral injury for healthcare professionals.
Yeah, and I guess a recent statement about workforce planning, among other things that came out from all the Royal Colleges, I think you were signatory to. I'm going to just ask you to close perhaps by telling us a little bit about your book, Andy. You spent some time in the States. You've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about all of this. What have you concluded, and what can we expect from the book?
Well, thanks very much. I've got so much else on my plate at the moment that I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that my book will be a year away anyway. I've drafted it, but as you'll know, there's a lot of work in getting from a draft to a final draft. I've driven to write it by my clinical experience. This is my 40th winter in the National Health Service. There's no specific medal for that, but it is my 40th winter.
Well, congratulations there.
And I think that one of the things that maybe the most powerful things that I've seen happening is that I went into geriatric medicine primarily to ensure that older people got a fair share of resources in healthcare. And when I first went in, it was the case that sometimes they didn't. However, nowadays, it's the other way around. Most of my clinical work is trying to make sure that older people are not exposed to unnecessary investigations and treatment, which they cannot benefit from. And for a whole number of reasons, medicine has drifted that way. So that was one big driver for the book. And the other is the basic fact that the baby boomers are a big generation. In 2050, every surviving baby boomer will be over 85. That will mean, from country to country, it'll vary a bit, but that between 2 and 3 times as many individuals over the age of 85 as we currently have. Dependency and Laslow's fourth age concentrates in the over 85s. We cannot, at the moment, provide adequate care, in my opinion, for people in that fourth age of their life. And we need now to start planning to do that. We can still push for healthy longevity. Of course we should, but we have to acknowledge that we will have a growing number of people who are in the fourth age, and we need to plan to care for them better. So I'm hoping my book might draw attention to that.
Well, I'm sure I and many others in the field look forward very much to reading it. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Andy, and conversations that could go on for a very long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
We are very grateful to our sponsor, Juvenescence. For more podcasts, visit our website, thelongevityforum.com, or follow us on Twitter, longevity_forum.